When Larissa Harrington stepped into the coffee shop that winter afternoon, every head turned. Not in admiration, but in careful avoidance. The 20-year-old woman wore her long hair swept over the left side of her face, but it couldn't hide the burn scars that stretched from her forehead to her chin. People whispered behind their hands. A mother pulled her child closer. Someone's coffee cup paused midway to their lips. They all wondered the same thing. What was she doing here? Meeting that single dad who could barely afford his rent. When Larissa's breathing grew shallow and she turned to leave, ashamed, Finn Carter stood from his table. He walked straight toward her. She braced herself for rejection, for the polite excuse, for the look of horror. Instead, Finn gently reached out and took her trembling hand in his. The room fell silent. No one moved. And for the first time in 3 years, Larissa felt seen. But to understand how they arrived at that moment, we need to go back to where it all began. Finn Carter was 36 years old, and life had worn him down in ways that showed around his eyes. He stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders built from years of physical labor, but there was a gentleness to him that contradicted his size. His face was kind, lined with exhaustion from working double shifts at a small auto repair garage on the outskirts of Phoenix. Every morning, he woke at 5 to pack his daughter's lunch. Every night, he fell asleep with grease still under his fingernails. His wife had left when their daughter was only 3 years old. She'd said she couldn't bear the poverty anymore, couldn't stand the small apartment and the broken-down car and the endless stretching of every dollar. She'd walked out on a Tuesday morning and never looked back. Finn had spent the years since then convinced of one thing. He would never be enough for anyone to love. His daughter, Serafina, was 7 years old now. She had her mother's dark curls, but her father's steady brown eyes. She was polite and perceptive in the way children become when they've had to grow up faster than they should. She noticed when her father skipped meals so she could have seconds. She noticed when he counted coins at the grocery store. And she noticed, with the clarity only children possess, when adults were cruel or kind. Serafina had one particular fear that haunted her young heart, that her mother might come back and take her father away, leaving her alone. She clung to Finn with a fierce, protective love. Larissa Harrington's life had been entirely different before the accident. Before the fire that changed everything, she had been beautiful in the conventional way people measure such things. She'd been the homecoming queen at her university, an accomplished pianist, vibrant and confident. Her father, Clinton Harrington, was a billionaire who'd made his fortune in real estate and technology. Larissa had grown up in a world of private schools and charity galas, where people smiled at her not just because of who she was, but because of who her father was. Then came the car accident 3 years ago. Larissa had been 23, riding with her stepmother to a family event. The vehicle had been T-boned at an intersection. Fuel leaked. Fire erupted. The door on Larissa's side jammed. She'd screamed as flames licked through the broken window, touching her face, her neck, her shoulder. A truck driver had finally pulled her free, but not before the damage was done. Her stepmother had survived with minor injuries. Larissa had spent 8 months in burn units and reconstructive surgeries. When she finally looked in a mirror, the girl she'd known was gone. The scars stretched from her left temple down across her cheek and jaw, textured and discolored. A permanent reminder of those terrible seconds. But worse than the physical scars was the way people looked at her afterward. The stares, the whispers, the carefully averted eyes. Friends stopped visiting. Her fiancé had ended their engagement with a phone call, unable to even face her. Her father, trying to protect her, had isolated her further. Clinton had told the press that Larissa was studying abroad. He'd kept her hidden in the family estate, believing he was sparing her from the world's cruelty. But all he'd done was convince her that she was something shameful, something to be concealed. Larissa had withdrawn completely. She'd stopped going outside except for medical appointments. She'd stopped looking at herself in mirrors. She'd stopped believing that anyone could look at her with anything other than pity or disgust. Her voice had become small, barely above a whisper. She had panic attacks in crowded spaces. The confident young woman had disappeared into someone who moved through the world like a ghost, always trying to take up less space, to be less visible, to disturb the world as little as possible. Her father, Clinton Harrington, was 60 years old and had the kind of power that came from decades of ruthless business decisions. He loved his daughter fiercely, protectively, but his love was controlling. He believed that only someone of equal wealth and status could truly value Larissa. He monitored her few outings. He had his security team report on anyone she spoke to. When he looked at the world, he saw threats and social climbers everywhere, and he was absolutely certain that a poor mechanic with a failed marriage had no place in his daughter's life. The meeting that would change everything happened on a cold January afternoon at the Scottsdale Fashion Square. Serafina had begged Finn to take her shopping for a birthday present for her best friend. He'd agreed, even though it meant adding to the credit card debt he was already struggling with. They'd walked through the bright, crowded mall, Serafina's small hand in his. Then Finn's ex-wife appeared. She'd come out of nowhere, materializing from the crowd like a bad dream. She wanted money. She wanted to see Serafina. She wanted to disrupt the careful peace Finn had built. While Finn tried to handle the confrontation calmly, keeping his voice low so Serafina wouldn't be scared, the little girl had slipped away. She'd seen her mother and panicked. Running blindly through the crowd, Finn's heart had stopped when he turned and found Serafina gone. He'd called her name, pushing through the shoppers, his panic rising with every second. Meanwhile, across the mall, Larissa had been attempting one of her rare outings. She wore an oversized hoodie, sunglasses, and a medical mask that covered most of her face. She'd been standing near a fountain when she'd heard a child crying. Serafina had been terrified, lost in the sea of strangers. When Larissa had knelt down, her mask had slipped. The little girl had looked directly at the burn scars covering half of Larissa's face. Larissa had frozen, waiting for the scream, for the fear, for the rejection she'd grown accustomed to. But Serafina had only tilted her head, her tears pausing. She'd reached out one small finger and gently touched Larissa's scarred cheek. Her voice had been soft, full of concern rather than fear. "Does it hurt?" she'd asked. "You must have been very brave." Something inside Larissa had shattered. She'd started crying behind her sunglasses. No one had looked at her scars with compassion in 3 years. Everyone had either stared in horror or looked away in discomfort. But this 7-year-old child had seen only someone who had suffered and survived. Serafina had put her small arms around Larissa's neck. "It's okay," the little girl had whispered. "You're still pretty. You just look like you fought a dragon." That was when Finn had found them. He'd been running, breathless and terrified, and then he'd seen his daughter safe in the arms of a hooded stranger. Larissa had stood quickly, her mask back in place, preparing for the man to snatch his child away from the frightening, scarred woman. Instead, Finn had dropped to his knees, looking at his daughter to make sure she was unhurt. And then he looked up at Larissa. His eyes had been warm with gratitude, not fear. "Thank you," he'd said, his voice thick with relief. "Thank you so much for keeping her safe." Larissa had barely been able to speak. She'd nodded, starting to back away. But Serafina had grabbed her hand. "Daddy, she's nice," the little girl had insisted. "Can we buy her hot chocolate, please? She helped me." Finn had smiled, and it had transformed his tired face into something gentle and genuine. "Of course we can," he'd said. He'd looked at Larissa. "If you'd like to join us, it's the least we can do." Larissa had wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to disappear back into her safe isolation. But there had been something in the way this man looked at her, something in the way his daughter held her hand without fear, that made her whisper okay before she could stop herself. They'd gone to a small cafe in the mall. Larissa had sat across from Finn and Serafina, her hands shaking as she slowly removed her mask to drink. She'd felt every eye in the cafe turn toward her, heard the whispers, felt the familiar shame crawling up her spine. Her breathing had started to quicken, panic setting in. Then Finn had done something she'd never forget. He'd casually shifted his position, angling his body so that he blocked the stares from the other tables. He didn't make a big show of it. He didn't even acknowledge it. He just quietly positioned himself as a shield. Serafina had chattered happily, completely unbothered by Larissa's scars. She talked about school and her favorite books and how her daddy worked really hard. But they were happy anyway. Finn had been warm but not intrusive, asking Larissa gentle questions. Where did she go to school? What did she like to do? He treated her like a person, not a curiosity, not a tragedy. When Serafina had spilled her hot chocolate, Larissa had laughed. It had been a small sound, rusty from disuse, but genuine. Finn had noticed. He'd smiled at her, and for just a moment, Larissa had felt like the girl she used to be. The girl who laughed easily and didn't spend every moment convinced she was being judged. When they'd finally parted ways, Serafina had hugged Larissa goodbye. You look like a princess who fought a dragon and won, the little girl had declared seriously. That makes you even braver than the princesses in my books. Larissa had cried in her car for an hour after they'd left. She'd cried because a child had seen her as brave instead of broken. She'd cried because a stranger had protected her without being asked. She'd cried because she'd forgotten what it felt like to be treated like a human being instead of a medical case or a source of pity. That night, back at the family estate, Larissa had found herself smiling at the memory. She'd hidden that smile like a treasure, pressing it into her pillow where no one could see, but her father had noticed the change in her. Clinton Harrington had security footage from the mall reviewed. When he'd seen his daughter talking to a man and child, he'd had them investigated. Within 24 hours, he'd known everything about Finn Carter. The failed marriage, the low income, the small apartment, the mountain of debt. Clinton had called Larissa into his study. I know you met someone today, he'd said, his voice hard. A mechanic, a single father, someone completely inappropriate. Larissa had felt her brief happiness crumble. He was kind to me, she'd said quietly. He didn't look at me like I was a monster. Her father's expression had softened slightly, but not enough. People like that see opportunity when they look at our family. He's probably already planning how to exploit you. For the first time in 3 years, Larissa had felt anger instead of shame. He didn't even know who I was, she'd said, her voice stronger. He just saw someone who helped his daughter. Clinton had forbidden her from seeing Finn again. He'd threatened to cut off her access to therapy, to her small freedoms. But something had changed in Larissa. A small spark of defiance had been lit. She'd found Finn's number through the garage where he worked. She'd called him, her voice shaking, and asked if she could see him again, to thank him properly for being kind. Finn had been surprised, but pleased. I'd like that, he'd said. Serafina hasn't stopped talking about the brave dragon-fighting princess. They'd agreed to meet at a small coffee shop the following week. Larissa had spent the days leading up to it in a state of anxiety and hope she'd thought she'd lost forever. She'd practiced in the mirror, trying to get used to her own reflection again. She'd chosen her clothes carefully, something that covered her scars but didn't look like she was hiding. The day of their meeting, Larissa had almost turned back 3 times on the drive over. When she'd parked outside the coffee shop and seen people through the windows, her chest had tightened. She'd sat in her car for 15 minutes, trying to breathe, trying to convince herself she could do this. Finally, she'd forced herself to walk to the door. The moment she'd stepped inside, she'd known it was a mistake. Every person in the cafe had turned to look. She'd heard the gasps, the sudden silence, the whispered, "Oh my God," from somewhere to her left. A woman had pulled her child behind her, as if Larissa's scars were contagious. A man had actually gotten up and moved to a different table. Larissa's vision had started to tunnel. Her hands had gone numb. She'd turned to leave, to run back to her car and never attempt this again. Then she'd heard Finn's voice. Larissa. She'd turned. And he'd been standing at a corner table where he'd been waiting. Serafina had been with him, beaming. But what happened next was what changed everything.